All right, so to the people who will be listening to this later, I am here joined on Skype with Peter. Peter, how do I say your middle name?
Sjöstedt, but Sjöstedt is okay as well. Sjöstedt-H.
Sjöstedt-H.
Peter
Okay.
Sjöstedt-H, yeah.
And we are here to discuss his book, Numismatics.
Yep.
So why don't you, off the bat, man, tell me about the title here.
Okay. Well, the book is a collection of essays. I didn't really know what to call it, but I've combined Kant's concept noumena with Ernst Junger's concept psychonaut, because the book is really a mixture of metaphysics and analyses of psychedelic phenomenology. So that's the basis of the name, noumena and psychonaut. But nous means mind, and naut, originally comes from ship. So it sort of also indicates a kind of oceanic exploration of the mind.
I thought it was a kind of like a play with Kant and the psychonaut term that you introduced me to in some of your writing. So I had a feeling it was something like that, but I wasn't exactly sure.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's just a random name, designating a book.
So tell me about, I don't know where to start off first here. I mean, there's just so much in this book.
Do you have a list of questions, or is it off the cuff?
Well, I have a list of questions, but I was going to get to those later, and
okay.
They're actually by some mutual subscribers of ours.
All right.
And they're not necessarily pertaining to your book, so that's why I was going to say.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about those later then.
So I was hoping that you might elaborate on some of the ideas in here, like concerning process philosophy, that existence is movement, for example, that language is extremely useful because it is extremely misleading. So let's start with the first one. What do you mean by existence is movement?
I think you're quoting there from my essay on Bergson, which is based on
the outline.
Yeah, and that's based on the talk I gave at the Breaking Convention conference in 2013 about Bergson and psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
And to give a little preamble to that, one of the most famous books on psychedelia is from Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception. And in that book, he, in a small section, he tries to analyze the psychedelic experience, the mescaline experience in his case, by using Henry Bergson, and he quotes C.D. Broad, the philosopher C.D. Broad, on Bergson, and derives this whole reducing valve theory. So that's the reason I gave the talk and wrote the essay. By process philosophy, Bergson, you can say, is a process philosopher, although I think Alfred North Whitehead is the sort of godfather of that. But by the phrase, what was it, everything is movement, or
existence
is movement, is meant, well, the contrast of it is the more Aristotelian common conception that reality consists of things with attributes. So an atom has the attribute of charge and so on and so forth. This, I believe, comes from our grammar, our syntax, really. So you have a noun, and then you have predicate to it, an adjective or whatever. The book is green, and so on. This is a very useful way of speaking, but when you apply that syntax to reality, I think you get into a lot of problems. So if you take away, for example, all the attributes of a subject, what are you left with? There seems to be something there, and perhaps this leads to Cartesian dualism and so on, the notion of a subject who's got attributes of body and so on.
Right.
So I follow Whitehead's and Bergson's line, really, and others, Heraclitus ultimately, by saying that what we mean by a thing is the totality of its attributes. There's nothing left behind. There's no real substance with attributes. There is only attributes, and those attributes are not solid either. That by attribute you're really referring to an event or a set of events, and ultimately everything can be analysed in Whitehead by these actual entities or eventities, along with eternal objects. So that's not that's not maybe an easy answer, but ultimately what it means is that everything is flux, everything is change, and there's no solidity in reality, in actuality.
So what are these? Maybe you could flush out this idea of actual entities just a little more. Like, what do you mean by actual entities?
Actual entities is a term coined by Alfred North Whitehead. He also calls them actual occasions, and also drops of experience. So one way to think about it is to think of it as the ultimate constituent of all actuality. So if we go from this cup of tea here in front of me, go down to the molecules, we go down to the atoms, the subatomic particles, and so on, eventually you'll actually reach an ultimate form, and that for Whitehead is the actual entity. And that is a process, and it gets very technical and very complicated, but it's ultimately a process which includes, or which is rather, from one aspect, experience itself, a very basic experience, not akin to human consciousness in the slight at all, but nonetheless there's a feeling there, and those little drops of feeling, those drops of experience, those actual entities, are the building blocks of reality for Whitehead. And that's why his philosophy is also, as well as a process philosophy, because these actual entities are processes, it's also a pan-experientialism or panpsychism, because mentality, and not consciousness, but mentality, sentience, is at the foundation of things. Which sounds crazy to a lot of people, I know, but it explains, it resolves a number of paradoxes up the line, like the hard problem of consciousness and so on, the emergent problem, so on and so forth.
Right. This kind of reminds me of arguments I used to have with theists about their God concept, and they would always describe God by some sort of function, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so God is love, God is this or that, but we never learn what God is. We learn what He does, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say it's like the concept of God is like separating the function from the performer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like
and thus you have
to picture riding a bike without legs or limbs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it's like you mean it's sort of separating something sort of which holds together all the attributes, but then the actual entity itself is unknown. Is that what you mean?
Well, what I'm saying here is that the function and the performer are the same thing. Right? The riding a bike is a process.
Yeah.
And then when you separate those two, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the ultimate point. Yeah. And that's also linked into the first thing you said there about how language can be extremely useful but extremely misleading, because we have God is omniscient, God is omnipresent, and so on and so forth. We have all these subject predicate forms of syntax, propositions, which sort of leads you to believe that the attribute, the predicate, must refer to something, and the subject, God, whatever it may be, also refers to something but separate. And so we get this linguistic illusion that we're talking about two things here, whereas in reality they are one. But of course, it's very useful to speak in these terms because we can communicate quickly, and it's also the basis of logic, symbols and logic, and so on, which creates technology, which means we can predict the future, we can create medicine, weapons, so on and so forth. But ultimately, language is a double-faced. It's great and it's terrible at the same time.
Yeah, it's good for what it's used for, but it can be misused and misapplied.
I think ultimately you have to just realize that language is a tool, as you say, it's a tool for communication, but when applied to analyzing reality, it gets in the way.
Right.
But it's the only tool we have.
Alan Watts talked a lot about, he would say, like innumerable ghosts in language, and he would point these out by He would say, is a tree made of wood? And he would say, no, a tree is wood. Or he would say, the lightning flashes.
Right. Yeah. Nietzsche made that analogy as well, of course. Yeah. The separation of the deed and the doer, as Nietzsche calls it.
Yes.
It's the same point, yeah. And I think I'm pretty sure Alan Watts was influenced by Whitehead, and Whitehead's got an actual name for it. He calls it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
Yes.
Which is also known as the fallacy of reification, which is basically to think that a concept or word refers to an actual thing. And this really is the weapon that Whitehead yields against all these other theories, and which makes me favour him above other philosophers at the moment.
Yes, he really brings a real oneness to ontology. Everything is like, I see the universe as one huge process, and then we're all little processes in that's a part of that huge process.
I mean, in that sense, you're right. It's akin to Leibniz and his monadology. I think as well it's compatible with Nietzsche. And you and I both know there's this debate, don't we, about whether Nietzsche's will to power was an intrinsic, immanent, sentient aspect to all force. And there are people like Woodbury Clark who say absolutely not, and there are other people such as myself who say absolutely it was the case, at least in his later writings. But one thing
I've heard from, I hate to cut you off, but I just wanted to say something on that line of thought that you brought up, which is one thing I've heard too, is that they'll say that, well, you see, it was actually a parody. He wasn't serious about the will to power being some sort of form of idealism, or it was a parody, and he discards this theory in or what did they say in his latest work, which was the Antichrist.
That was Clark. Clark said that. Yeah, that's a parody in the 90s. I mean, in my book, actually, in the an addendum to the chapter on the will to power, I sort of criticised that. I mean, it's true that he talks about wearing masks and so on and playing with the reader, and he does put Beyond Good and Evil 36, we're talking about here, section 36 mostly.
Yes.
He does say, he puts it hypothetically. Imagine if we were to believe this, which is true. I don't think he ever goes against that in later works. I don't know which section Clark or you are referring to there, but I do know in his later Nachlass, later notebooks, which some of which is found in this collection, The Will to Power. He really, goes into it more, this notion of the will to power as the effect form, the effective, like the sentient, the feel form of all causality, of all force. And my personal view is that Nietzsche was developing this, what you could call perhaps power panpsychism, in his, towards the end of his cognitive life, but he was never sure about it, and I think that's why section 36 of Beyond Good and Evil was hypothetical, because he wasn't entirely sure about it. The same, I think, applies to his notion of the eternal return, and I know that he sort of changed his mind on that a bit as time went on, the eternal return. But if you look into his notebooks, as I know you personally have, you will see a lot of discussion about the will to power as an immanent aspect of all force. In other words, there's a feeling within all force, we only see the shell of things, the representation, as Schopenhauer might say. So I think Nietzsche sort of returned to Schopenhauer. This is what his lover Lou Salome suggested as well, that he returned to Schopenhauer later in life, because Schopenhauer's got this notion of intrinsic will in all force, and I think this was the way he was going, but unfortunately, he went mad and never finished that task. But even if he didn't believe that, even if it was all just a game he was playing on people, I mean, for a start, you could say that about any aspect of his philosophy, really, anyway. But even if it were not his personal view, I still think it's a very good view. It's a very plausible account of reality, anyway. So the question as to whether Nietzsche himself actually believed it or not is academic.
Right. Well, I think he definitely did have some sort of idealism going on there.
If you call it I mean, I wouldn't call it idealism, because although, I mean, I would say that panpsychism is not idealism. I mean, Timothy Sprigg, for example, calls it absolute idealism. I know, but I think my reason for not calling it idealism would be that I always think that idealism generally assumes a representationalism, that our mental images are representations of reality,
Right.
which I don't think panpsychism, at least not in its major forms, not in the Whiteheadian form at least. I don't think in the Nietzschean form, if you accept that, I don't think that is the case. But this is a matter of great debate and great complexity that we can't really get into.
I gotcha. I think I will ask you one of these questions now, since it's kind of on the topic that we're on, concerning process thought.
Okay.
And so here's what Ratz, however you want to pronounce his name, Johannes Ratz.
That rings a bell,
yeah. He has a channel here on YouTube, and he's I think he's been a student of quantum physics.
Right.
So here he asks, he says, ask him, that is you, if he thinks some of the current developments in physics lend credence to his metaphysical position.
By his metaphysical position, you mean mine?
Correct.
Well, that's the latest. I mean, what was he specific? I mean, which latest developments in physics?
No, he wasn't specific. No.
I mean, number one, I'm not a physicist, so I'm not. I haven't read the latest paper. Well, I haven't read many papers on physics, really. I mean, it's not my field, of course. The only thing I can say, which is nothing new, is that quantum physics obviously destroys this old Victorian notion of, or Socratic, Greek, yes, ultimately, this old notion of materialism, mechanism,
Right.
that everything's reducible to particles operating with attributes according to laws. I think the fact of wave particle collapse and bilocality and so on and so forth. I mean, that gets rid of these traditional forms of materialism, which of course I don't think physicists have believed in them for 100 years. But I think a lot of biologists still implicitly assume this ontology, this materialist ontology. So in that sense, because I'm an anti-materialist, I would say that physics certainly does. But unless you're specific about what aspect of physics you mean, I can't really say much more.
Yeah, and unfortunately he wasn't specific, so maybe let this be a lesson to you, Rats.
I'm sorry, Rats. But like I say, it's not my field, physics, anyway. So.
All right, smart move. I try not to chat with him too much about that, because
one thing I also,
I don't even understand the terms he throws
right.
out. So
I mean, one thing I also try to avoid when you read philosophers who sort of use the latest findings in science to back up their views or contradict their other people's views. It's always very embarrassing, after once it's come to about 30 years of age. So it's always this new finding from 1965 or something, which today no one believes in anyway. So I think, generally speaking, philosophers have to be very wary of using science in their arguments.
Okay.
Another reason for me not to comment too much on
it. All right. So I guess let's move on to kind of like a philosophy of mind topic. And one of the things that it says here in the back of your book, in the description, it says that that you navigate through the subjects such as Sentience of Cells, right? Now, how far down the line do you think that sentience goes down? Like, would you say like a molecule or an atom, or does it just stop at the cell, or when does something become sentient?
Well, for Whitehead, as I indicated, it goes down all the way down to the actual entities. And a molecule, an atom, and so on, and a cell are merely what he calls societies of those actual entities. So, and Leibniz likewise, said this, and ultimately, Schopenhauer did, and so on and so forth. So, I think the problem generally is, and the reason that it's more parsimonious to go all the way down the line, which is panpsychism, is that it's always very difficult to draw a line between sentient entities and insentient entities. So, for example, we know from our own personal cases that we are sentient as humans, or me, myself, at least. We assume other humans are. That's as far as Descartes went. But then most people, I think, assume that dogs have sentience, birds, and then things get a bit muddy. So, how about a bee or an insect generally? Do they have sentience? Why should a being not have sentience, an entity not have sentience? The general argument is, well, when it hasn't got a brain or nervous system. But this, of course, is not an empirical fact, and it's not an analytic fact. We don't know that sentience requires a brain. This is just an assumption. It seems more parsimonious to go again with Whitehead and Nietzsche and so on, to assume that all entities, by which we mean sort of a fluctuation of force, contain basic forms of sentience. Now, again, I emphasize that's not consciousness, that's not conceptual thought, and it's not counterfactual thought about what could have been, and it's not thought about what you did last weekend or whatever. But basic sense of feeling, I believe, is there all the way down the line. If you don't believe that, if you believe, as most people do today in the West at least, if you believe that sentience at some point in history emerged out of insentience, you need to explain that. You need a very good description of how that takes place. William James writes about this. So the burden of proof, in this sense, is on the non-panpsychist. How do you know? How can you explain sentience coming out of insentience? I mean, the common answer is, well, there was sort of some basic form of, attraction, which then led to like a slight form of sentience. But however small and however basic it gets, you've still got this totally radical jump from something which is insentient, which means that it's purely describable in terms of space and time, in other words, mechanically, to something sentient. Let's say, for argument's sake, a feeling of desire, some basic form of desire, hunger, or something else, which is not describable spatio-temporally. You can't describe hunger in terms of, well, in time you can, but you certainly can't describe it in terms of space. You can't say hunger is 10 centimeters wide and so on. So you've got this radical, at least epistemic shift, and for them ontological shift, which requires explanation. And I think such explanation, it doesn't exist because it didn't happen. And I think it's just, again, it's far more plausible to think that sentience emerged only in degree of complexity, but which is less problematic than believing that sentience emerged in kind out of insentience, brute emergence as it's known.
I think a lot of materialists, physicalists, see their position as a default.
Yep.
They come to this conclusion that what is external is the in itself, and we are made up of that. That is our mind or consciousness is, there was just, it's like they think that it is,
well,
what's the right term? Like it's arrogant to think that consciousness existed. Like they think that because they see consciousness, I think, as like a progression, like of evolution, and so they think like, well, there's this vast time, where consciousness did not exist, and how dare you think that be so arrogant as to think that consciousness is something special. Like I hear them use that word a lot, special. Like I just don't think that they'll say like I don't think consciousness is some spooky special thing, right?
Well, I don't think that either. I mean, also, again, in terms of terminology, Nietzsche says something likewise, that consciousness is nothing special. But it's very important to distinguish consciousness from sentience again. So the way I'd reply to that is to say that, Bertrand Russell made this point with his neutral monism. It's a very logical point. It's got nothing to do with, it's nothing new agey about it or anything like, or religious even. It's a purely logical point that when we see reality and when we describe reality, we merely see the shell of it, the outside of it. The question as to whether it has an inside, an immanence, an intrinsicness, is at the very least unknown to us. So then you can assume that all matter or all matter energy has an intrinsic aspect, which would be the mental side, or you can assume that it has not, and it's just pure insentient matter. But where's the burden of proof? There's no burden of proof either way. And of course, in philosophy, people get very angry because they think certain things are blatantly obvious. It's like obviously that the mentality didn't exist before animals emerged or whatever. But of course, when you think something's obvious in philosophy, generally it's because you haven't done the reading. You don't know the contrary views, and so on and so forth. That's right. That's what I've generally found, and that's affected me a lot personally. I mean, I'm 36 now. When I was in my 20s, I thought I knew a lot. I thought certain things were obviously true and obviously false, and it just sort of shocked me when I heard people say the contrary view. As I get older and read more and talk to more people, I realise that I had so many assumptions in my youth, so many assumptions which are very questionable.
So you're 36 now.
Yes.
I thought I was like a month older than you or something.
How old are you?
I'm 36, but I just turned 36 on the 1st, so I was.
Well, okay, no. I'm almost 37 now, in August.
Oh, okay. So
must be about a year.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But anyway, yeah. So I mean, Oscar Wilde. I think it was Oscar Wilde, unless it's misattributed to him. But he said, "I'm not young enough to know everything," and I think this sums it up nicely. I think also there's a psychological urge for young men, in the 20s especially, to need to know the truth. I think it's a power thing, and it's the basis, I think, of religious fundamentalism as well. Anyway, I think generally as you get older, you become more agnostic about all matters. And when there's no solution to things like the mind-body problem, it pushes you then into unusual avenues such as panpsychism, and that's why I'm there now.
Right.
But I should also say this about a very basic argument would be something like, we know that the mind is caused by the brain or is identical to the brain. I mean, that relationship itself is extremely complicated and unknown. We know there's a correlation between the mind and the brain, but what's the relation of that correlation? The rain and clouds are correlated, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing. Are they identical? Are they causal? Which way causal? So on and so forth. But it will often be said something like, we know that if you have brain damage or if you take certain drugs, you have alteration in the brain, thus you have an alteration in the mind, so therefore we know that the mind is the brain or the mind is caused by the brain. But of course, under a Whiteheadian pan-experientialist view, you'd also expect that, because every cell in your brain has a sentience, and when those are somehow affected through brain damage, you would get a change in the total mind state as well. So that's not an argument against it at all.
So wouldn't it follow that if you have a process ontology, that there would be no absolute distinction between anything? There would be degrees of distinction, but no absolute distinction.
I mean, that's
like between me and my environment, and
yes.
So wouldn't there be no absolute distinction between the mind and the brain, ultimately?
Ultimately, yes. I mean, the mind and the brain are both abstractions, by which I mean that you've extracted part of concrete reality into a concept, you reified it, and then you've thought that was real. So for Whitehead, matter is an abstraction. It's part of concrete reality, which includes mind, but you've abstracted mind away from that, and you've turned that into a real concrete reality. This is a typical example of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And then the irony is that a materialist who has done that will then try to recreate mind out of the abstraction which omitted it in the first place. And of course, this is why we've got this problem of consciousness, because it can't be done. You can't create the reality which you've abstracted away from. So yeah, like ultimately, there's a monism there, which is that mind and matter are the same thing, ultimately. And so as a result of that as well, you get, dichotomies such as the organic and the inorganic also false. Everything's organic. That's why Whitehead's philosophy is called the philosophy of organism. And his famous phrase, which I've become sick of repeating now, but I'll say it one last time to you, is biology is the study of the larger organisms, whereas physics is the study of the smaller organisms. So you've got this. So it's a complete control or delete on one's general ontology. But yeah, I mean, it's very uncommon. I mean, I think there's a historical political reason as to why it's not a particularly common view, and I think it ultimately goes back to the Church, the Catholic Church, which is that, under the Judeo-Christian tradition, God made man in his image and his likeness, and the animals and the creatures were created for man. And with Descartes, you get this who was a Catholic, you get this notion that only man has mind, soul. Soul and mind were the same for him. All other entities, such as even dogs, have no mind whatsoever. And of course, this was very much in accord with Catholic or Christian doctrine that only humans could go to heaven and hell and so on. So it didn't make sense for the rest of nature to have minds and decisions. And what Descartes did as a mathematician as well, of course, is he created this human mind or soul, and he made the rest of nature completely mathematical, mechanical. So, and I think historically what's happened is that Western science has taken this Cartesian dualism, that there's this big distinction between mechanism and mind, which is a false dichotomy, I think. But what's happened is we've got rid of this notion of the soul, and we're stuck with mechanism, which is still a result of dualism, substance dualism, really. This bifurcation, which is this fallacy of reification. So we're left with this view of mechanical nature from which we try to create mind again through emergence or whatever, unsuccessfully. And as a result, panpsychism is not an option. Panpsychism is the view that the rest of nature is alive, that's hylomorphism really, and is mindful. I think that the Church promoted Descartes. I think Meditations was dedicated to the Pope, and the Catholic Church also burnt people with non-Catholic views, such as Bruno. Bruno was burnt at the stake in 1600. He was a panpsychist. So there was a sort of conscious, forceful, physical move to establish a certain theory of mind for religious reasons originally. But that is part of our legacy today. So part of my mission, at least in academia, at university, is to say this notion of mental ubiquity is actually very plausible.
Right. I like what Alan Watts talked about this narrative with the universe being made out of stuff, right? And we're put here, right? God is a carpenter, he's a creator, and he makes things and he puts people here. So we always have this notion of why am I here, right? Like I'm this, as he says, a stranger and afraid in a world you never made, right? And so you have this notion of stuff. The earth is existence is stuff, right. And he says that this is like a remnant of that the mechanistic world is actually, as you've said, a remnant left over from Christianity, basically. And now you have this ghost in a machine, and people are trying to figure out. They're basically left denying the ghost, which is the very thing which knows that it exists in the first place, right? And that perceives the world, and that does the denying in the first place. And they're left trying to explain the explainer, and trying to do it all through mechanism, but the explainer is not a quantitative thing. It's not something you can pour in a in a vial or a test tube.
Yes, it's not spatially describable. Yes. Alan Watts is great at analogies. That's his real gift, I think.
Yeah, he was my introduction to Whitehead into process philosophy.
Right. Yeah. So I think he's done a great job in popularizing it, actually, to such an extent that a number of his notions, like everything is process. I think that sort of entered the mainstream through Watts, rather than Whitehead. Whitehead is basically very technical, so therefore it would take much longer for him to get into the public zeitgeist.
Right. Many have asked me, why do you have, why do I have Alan Watts videos on my YouTube channel when I'm not like Buddhist or any of that kind of stuff, and that's exactly why, because you'll notice that most of the ones that I do have up are concerning like explaining what we've just covered here, which is process. Right? Yeah. And that was like my first introduction. So when I read your book, I already had something to build on, some understanding to build on. It wasn't totally foreign to me. I would say that the only part in here that was probably totally foreign to me was the psychedelic experience.
Right.
But not exactly, because you had sent me a PDF of your what was it,
Metaphysics or something? Yeah. That was the first essay I wrote about it, really. Yeah. That was an essay which was I'm not I didn't really take drugs when I was younger, except for the common ones, but it wasn't really an interest of mine until I taught theology. Interestingly, I was lecturing philosophy, and I was roped in to do some theology as well. And I thought, okay, why not? But I had to do a lot.
Were you an atheist at the time?
I was probably, yeah. I was in, my mid-20s. I think I was sort of, your typical Dawkins type, atheist, neo-Darwinist type. And anyway, I was teaching, for example, all these arguments for God's existence, the ontological argument, cosmological, so on and so forth, teleological. And there's one argument from experience which was not a rational argument, so you couldn't use reason against it, whereas you could use reason against the others, And then I also read William James's great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and the chapter on mysticism there, where he talks about the ineffable, which is the most famous part probably, goes into mystical states being equivalent to psychedelic states. He didn't use the word psychedelic. It was coined in the 1960s, I think, by Humphrey Osmond. But he talks about nitrous oxide intoxication. And later on, William James writes a lot more about nitrous intoxication. I mean, he even said he understood Hegel after taking nitrous oxide. But anyway, so this interested me a lot, because I'd never really tried, nitrous oxide or whatever. So I decided to sort of experiment. And I did, and it was such I tried when it was legal, magic mushrooms, and it's just such an incredibly awe-inspiring, dynamic experience that it really sort of completely woke me from my dogmatic slumber, as Kant said of Hume. It just sort of changed my whole perspective on reality, really. And what I did then is I thought, okay, so who's written about this experience? I mean, philosophically, let's get to the core points here. And very little has been written about it, interestingly, in philosophy. There are parts, like I say, William James started it probably, and as I discovered later, Nietzsche took a lot of psychoactive drugs, but little written about it. So that's partly why I published the book as well, to sort of say, look, there's a whole new world of of consciousness here, which no one's properly analysed. And yeah, so that micro-metaphysics then was just a sort of dabbling in an introduction to my experience, like a trip report in one way, but also attempts at a sort of philosophical analysis of what was going on.
Yeah, for you people listening later, his experiences with magic mushrooms that he records are in this book. Aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, they are. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. And like, I wouldn't say it was totally foreign to me, because I think, I told you probably online not too long, or I don't know, maybe a year ago or so. I don't remember when it was, but in some course of one of our many discussions, I had brought up that I had done acid at one point, like a long time ago, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, in that area. So like, I kind of understand some of it, some of the psychedelic experience, but it wasn't as grandiose, if I may use that word, as your experience was. And some people have said, well, maybe you just took a bad hit or something, but
or maybe you didn't take enough.
I'm talking about more than one occasion that I did LSD. So they would all have to have been bad. You know what I mean? And I don't think that's. Maybe it's just the way my mind works or something.
Could be. I mean, there's so many factors to take into account. I mean, there's set and setting, the classic one. There's a substance you took. I mean, maybe you'd be better off with psilocybin, for example. There's a dose, of course. There's also your bodily condition at the time. There's your mindset at the time, as I say. So on and so forth. There's cultural expectations, how you handle fear generally, and so on and so forth. So who knows? I mean, you could try it again and you could get a completely different experience. But for me, at least, I mean, it was the sublime. I mean, it was the sort of spiritual sublime, really. The question as to the veridicality of it is an interesting philosophical question, one which I haven't decided upon yet.
Right, and I guess, I've had some people, I can't remember who they were at this point, but, just said, commenting on you, saying that they didn't agree with. I think they have the idea that that you think that psychedelic experience gives you a window into metaphysics, right? And I think these are like materialists that are coming from a point where they're like, oh no, that's just subjective. Hallucinations do not tell you about reality, right? I could think I'm Jesus Christ, right? But that's obviously false, right? And I think they're kind of, because they're coming from a different presupposition, right? They're coming from this materialist, physicalist worldview, that they're making these assumptions.
Well, for a start, I mean, I'm not saying that they are not hallucinations. They might be. I mean, certainly some of them are. But you shouldn't, I think it's very easy to generalize. I mean, the psychedelic experience, again, is a concept, but actually it's analyzable into so many different forms. In fact, the talk I gave in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago on Whitehead and the psychedelic experience sort of tries to divide those forms a little bit. And there was another talk actually about it as well, about different forms of psychedelic experience. So you can easily make general statements. A professor at Exeter University asked me a month ago or so. He said, what value has this experience got? And I said, at the very least, even from a materialist point of view, at the minimum, it shows you the power of the mind. Psychedelic experience is so far beyond imagination, so far beyond dreams even, so far beyond hypnagogic hallucinations. It's in a different league altogether. So that's one value of it. Even if these are hallucinations, my God, that the human mind can create these hallucinations is an unbelievable phenomenon. And that's just the first thing to say.
Right.
But I'm not saying, I think there are certain philosophical results one can acquire from psychedelic experience. For example, in my talk in Amsterdam, I was speaking about vectorization, the notion of perception as the merging of the subject with the environment, and the disjunction of that is actually an abstraction. And I think that psychedelics, by sort of damaging the normal functioning of the brain and body, allow for an amplified vectorization. And the phenomenology involved there, I mean, if you take phenomenology as a philosophical discipline, that's where psychedelic experience can be very, very valuable indeed. And of course, that's not just phenomenology. In the Whitehedian sense, it's also ontology. It's the notion of vectorization or prehension. But anyway, this is all of this is a young, it's a young Wissenschaft, a young science, and I'm not claiming to have any definite answers at all. But all I'm saying is that there's a massive scope for investigation here, one that hasn't really been pursued.
Right, I agree. I just wanted to bring up. I thought it'd be only fair to just bring up some of the, the objections, at least one of them,
Well, I mean, if you say anything new, you'll get criticism for it. Or if you say anything, actually, you'll get criticism because everyone, especially in philosophy, everyone disagrees with each other. So
Yeah.
it's just part and parcel of the game, and I don't mind it at all.
No, I actually like that. It's not boring,
Yeah, exactly.
So we must move on, I'm afraid. I promised you it would be 45 minutes to an hour, and we're already, 50 minutes? So let's move on to neo-nihilism.
Okay.
And there's a questioner, it's a kind of a friend of mine, but I think he's also a subscriber of yours. His name is Matt Hansen, and he asks you this question. He says, do animals have any have rights in any sense, such as humans do, might, at least subjectively, or does animal rights itself have merit within a neo-nihilist perspective? Or how can values be, I told him one question, and obviously it's turning into a bit more than that, or how can values be justified from a moral nihilistic perspective? How can one justify going from one, accepting that morals are subjective and not absolute, and two, having values such as valuing animal rights, for example, and live or will according to them? I don't know. I don't understand what you're trying to say there.
So in one sentence, do animals have rights? Yeah, I suppose that's what he's asking. Or how can you value animal well-being? Okay. Well,
I think he's looking for, I think that's part of it, but I think he's also looking for some sort of argument from a neo-nihilist perspective to value animals or animal rights, or I think he's looking for, I think he's saying, look, I'm a neo-nihilist, but I like animals, and how do I defend that position? How do I defend some sort of animal rights position from that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I'd say is I don't really believe in rights. I mean, rights are only given by contract law or statute. That's what a right is. Human rights are given in statute by the UN, I don't believe in this notion of natural rights, that these statute rights are based on real sort of rights of nature. I don't believe in that. Jeremy Bentham famously said it's nonsense on stilts. So because I don't believe in human rights, natural human rights, I certainly don't believe in animal rights. I think it's just a concept which is very muddy, confusing, and it's just an irrational thing. It's a bit like saying, can animals be sinners? That's the first point I'd say. So animals don't have rights. Humans don't have rights either, except contractually. Now, of course, if a country bequeaths rights to animals in law, then they have rights, But of course, the question is, on what basis would a country or an authority give rights to animals? Bentham himself, of course, said that we should be more compassionate to animals, and that was based on his utilitarianism. And I think most animal rights advocates are ultimately utilitarians. They talk about the suffering of animals. And from a neo-nihilist point of view, I mean, that's also very problematic. I mean, in my text, Neo-Nihilism, I talk about the problems with utilitarianism. For example, that pleasure is of more value than pain is not can't be proved in any way. It's not an absolute. People like Nietzsche said it's not. The opposite is often the case. Pain can create creativity and so on and so forth. And Schopenhauer said, the purpose of life is not pleasure. This is a strange notion. Also, this notion in utilitarianism that everyone has an equal right to a vote when weighing up pleasure and pain. I mean, that seems to be begging the question. It's assuming a morality that everyone has equal rights as regards to consideration in order to prove a morality. And that's why I always say that utilitarianism really is a form of Christianity. All are equal under the eyes of God. There's that problem. And there's a number of other problems as well, of course. There's famous problems with utilitarianism. So I don't think you can base animal rights on utilitarianism at all. I don't think it's a valid formula. However, having said all that, I think a lot of animal abuse stems from, coming back to something we spoke about previously, comes from this Cartesian Judeo-Christian view that nature is mechanical. So it's sort of also that nature is without value, without intrinsic value. And also, of course, the Christian view that we are stewards of animals. In other words, animals are there for for human purposes. So right. I think that with, maybe it's not neo-nihilism really, but certainly with panpsychism or pan-experientialism, you can say that we humans are nothing special. So we are part of nature, and all of nature has sentience. All of nature thus has value, because for Whitehead, value is an inherent part of sentience. So in that sense, you could say that animal abuse is perhaps based again on this political, religious legacy we find ourselves in. So ultimately, I'll say this: I don't think you should try to defend animals by using the notion of rights or utilitarianism. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that you should abuse them. Of course,
That's if you want to be honest. You could always just play along as a neo-nihilist and prey on people who believe in like moral realists who believe in objective values or something like that.
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, lying is not immoral, obviously, in an immoral theory. So you could just say there are objective values, even though personally that it's just your personal preference.
Like I've discussed this with him in depth, and you and I are pretty much meta-ethical twins. So like I've pretty much given him the same answers to this question already in a roundabout way. Mm-hmm. But I've just basically said, look, you can argue, arguments like if you want X, you ought not do Y or ought do Y. Like it's always going to be predicated upon an if clause. You're always going to be arguing from some value that you're assuming. Like, X is bad for society, therefore we ought not do X, right? But you're assuming that society is a value, and you're, if you don't want to. Yeah.
Ultimately, all if clauses.
Society or whatever.
As Schopenhauer says, all if clauses are based ultimately on fear or desire. So an ought is predicated on an if, and the if is never objective. If you want this, then you ought to do this. If you don't want this, then you ought to do this. But the ought is objective in terms of it being perhaps the most efficient means of acquiring the end. But the end, the if clause, is always subjective. This is the ultimate premise of neo-nihilism. Yeah, as you say.
Okay, I always say like no objective if clause means no objective ought clause, something like that.
But that's true. I'd be a bit wary about saying no objective ought clause, because, as I said, there can be a best way to achieve something. If you, as I said in my book, if you want to lose weight, you ought not to eat as much. So that in a way that's an objective ought clause based on a subjective if clause. But of course, what you mean by there's no objective ought clause is that
it's based on a subjective if clause.
Yeah. So you have to be very careful with language here, obviously. But the ultimate point is anytime a person tells another person how they ought to behave, it's never an expression of a fact. It's always an expression of a power imperative, and that's where it links to Nietzsche.
Right. So, I wanted to ask you a personal question, or a question that I wanted to personally ask you a question. It's not a personal question,
Okay.
but I wanted to ask you.
It's language again.
I wanted to ask you, what would you say is the distinction between slave morality and herd morality? Isn't herd morality just another kind of form, a kind of newer form of slave morality?
I suppose it depends what you mean by herd morality. Again, it's a linguistic issue.
Well, okay, so
if you mean a morality where everyone follows each other, is that what you basically mean?
well, like, and it's basically like, secular ethics, for example, is a brilliant example of herd morality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's all based on right. You shouldn't do what is not conducive to society, one might say, or things like that. It's always what benefits the herd. It's the herd's evaluation, right?
Okay, well, in that case, I would say the difference would be something like you can imagine the Spartans having a herd morality, as they allegedly did. Women could have positions of power. Being a warrior was the ultimate ideal of a man in society, and so on and so forth. In a way, that's a herd morality, but it's not a slave morality, because for Nietzsche, at least, a slave morality is a form of resentment. You resent the power of others, and you therefore value those things which empower you as an underling. So compassion, pity, humility, and so on and so forth. For Nietzsche, this is slave morality, as he talks about in the genealogy of morality and Beyond Good and Evil. So Christianity is an example of, if we generalize, obviously Christianity's changed throughout time and space, but Christianity would, generally speaking, be an example of a slave morality that is a herd morality, whereas Spartan morality would be a herd morality which is not a slave morality. So I think a distinction can be made. You could have, in a sense, you could have a master morality which is a herd morality in the future, perhaps, or perhaps in the past already.
Now, just to let I don't know, not everybody knows everything about you or whatever. I don't know what information future listeners might know about you, but you actually originally released Neo-Nihilism as like your first book, and then you've now re-released it as a chapter in this current book that we're discussing, the Pneumatics.
Yeah. So, well, a lot of people said, "Can I get Neo-Nihilism in print?"
Yeah.
and like you, I think. And I always said it's too small, really, to print. It's an essay, really. It's a long essay. So when I
even got Kevin I. Slaughter to try to do it. I tried to get him to do it.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah,
vaguely remember something like that. But then, when I was going to publish my book Pneumatics, which is a collection of essays anyway, I thought, well, this is the ideal opportunity to release it in paperback. And so it's a chapter there. And in the book, I think it follows my chapter on Nietzsche and his drug use and how that might have affected his philosophy. So I think it sort of slots in nicely there.
That was something I wanted to get into, but we don't really have the time to get into everything. I mean, this is there's a lot in this book, so that I could have, discussed, but for days.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff there, a lot of weird stuff. But get the book from psychedelicpress.co.uk. It ships to America and worldwide, in fact. Don't get it off Amazon because the publisher gets very little money for that, and it takes longer. But if listeners are interested, get it from the publisher.
I'll leave the link in the description box of this. Well, this will be a video, so.
Thanks. I mean, if you listeners are interested, I've got a video on YouTube. It's a talk I gave on psychedelic influence on philosophy at Exeter University a few months ago, and that goes into Nietzsche and his drug use quite a lot, actually. Not as much as the book, but there's a fair amount there to get started.
And I'll actually leave a link to his channel, to Ontologistics, in the description box.
Thank you.
So that they'll and also you have a website too where you have other writings.
Yeah, philosopher.eu, and I've got a Facebook channel, Ontologistics, facebook.com/Ontologistics, so on and so forth, Twitter account, blah blah blah. It's all academia.edu. I've actually got a very interesting essay on academia and on my website called Whitehead's Nietzsche, which is would be of interest to those who are interested in both philosophers. Whitehead had a copy of Nietzsche's Will to Power, which he marked, and I've released it for the first time, or the marked parts at least, with a little introduction.
One final thing I'll just bring up, and maybe you could elaborate on this, but explain so neo-nihilism influenced a gentleman, I can't remember his name, but he was doing the Karnak.
Warren Ellis, yes.
For Marvel, is it Marvel Comics? Or
yeah.
Okay.
So, what happened there was one day I got a massive surge in sales of neo-nihilism. I sell quite a few, but one day, suddenly out of the blue, a massive surge, and I just had no idea why. And eventually I found out that this writer Warren Ellis had written a nice review of it on his in his newsletter, I think, which I never read, never got. But anyway, I sort of I thought, oh, that's great, and I think I thanked him for it on Twitter or something, and that was that. And then I hear next that Marvel had. Well, then actually I find out that Warren Ellis is a very famous comic book writer. I didn't know this before. Very well respected and esteemed in the comics world. A couple of my friends were telling me about him and some of the great work he's done in the past. He wrote, Iron Man 3, I think he wrote, and Batman and James Bond stuff and so on and so forth. So he's quite well known in that demographic. And then he wrote somewhere that Marvel had asked him to reinvent this character called Karnak. He's a superhero, and he's part of the Inhumans. I looked into it. Part of the Inhumans family, and his special power is that he finds the flaw in anything, and he's in any conceptual scheme, but also in any physical scheme. And he's a sort of philosopher superhero. And Warren Ellis was tasked with reinventing him, and so there's now a comic series called simply Karnak. I think it's on the 4th or 5th issue now, and he wrote that neo-nihilism inspired the comic character, which was totally unexpected from me. I didn't know neo-nihilism would do something like that, but there you go. And since then I've sort of become more acquainted with Warren Ellis, and recently, in fact, he interviewed me for the newsletter, which I've linked on my website somewhere. He actually interviewed me more about writing methods.
How much, if anything, did the book Might Is Right by Ragnar Redbeard influence you in writing? I'm asking because he says the philosophy of power a lot, and the subtitle is Neo-Nihilism, the Philosophy of Power. So
I think...
and then also, you say law is force, and he says might is right, right? And I think that law is force is kind of like saying might is right, but in an amoral sense, not like in a prescription sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the sort of philosophical problems with that book, as you know, that is often prescriptive, isn't it? Which is something I try to avoid morally, if not factually. But yeah, okay, how did it influence me? Well, I've read it many years ago. I always admired its aesthetic qualities more than anything else. I mean, it's an extremely powerful book in terms of the writing is just so powerful. I think at times even more powerful than Nietzsche, because of course Nietzsche was translated into the English, and Might Is Right is written in English originally, so he had more. It just comes across as more powerful. There are aspects of it I don't like. Cannibalism, for example, I'm not too keen on, some weird strange things like this. And but nonetheless, I don't think it had much of an influence on neo-nihilism philosophically. I mean, there's not that much philosophy there, but nonetheless, it's still enlightening. It makes you think about things in different ways, and it also showed me the power of good writing. I think, when I was younger, I just thought writing was about conveying information. Get the information across as succinctly as possible. after reading books like Might is Right and so on, which are not books, which is non-fiction, allegedly, it shows me that writing really is an art form, just like music or painting or whatever. And in that sense, at least, I think I used a lot of hyperbole in neo-nihilism. You'll notice that neo-nihilism, compared to the other essays in the book, is a very different style of writing. It's more accessible, but it's more powerful, it's generally more poetic. And I suppose you could say this, that poetic form within neo-nihilism was inspired by Might is Right, whereas the philosophical content, was mostly inspired by Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and a little bit of Hume and some others.
Right.
Stevenson.
Yeah, it was you like, one of the things I really like about it is that you get out so much information. You cover so much ground in, what is it, like, is it 13 pages or 30 pages, right? Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, I think it's 30 pages.
Right.
And you cover a lot in the book. I mean, it's well written, and it's, like you said, there's neo-nihilism has just really impacted a lot of people on the net.
Do you think so?
Oh, absolutely. Well, we know with the Marvel Comics guy that I've met people, many, many people over the years since it's been released, that people who have been, affected by it one way or another. Either they're pissed at it or they adopted it in some way. But,
Yeah, it's been more influential than I ever imagined, really. I mean, I wrote it originally. I had no intention of publishing it. It was just, the original draft was just sort of, I don't know, I was sort of experimenting with language, as I say, and also just trying to put across the points of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer in the most, concise manner possible, really. But then I amended it a bit, and then I published it on Amazon. I mean, I only published it on Amazon as well to understand how Amazon ebooks work, how Amazon publishing works. I certainly did not expect it to influence Marvel's superhero universe in any way. But if I had the intention, it probably never would have happened. So these things happen in life, don't they? Now and again.
Well, there's like, I'm going to listen to this later and say, oh, you should have asked him this or that or the other thing. But
well, we can always have another chat.
Yeah, that would be nice. I'd like to talk about power. We can probably talk about that for an hour.
Yes.
Define what power is.
Yeah. I mean, I've augmented my views on power with Whitehead's views on power now, actually. So there's a very interesting discussion to be had there. But again, like you say, that will take hours, really.
Yeah, well, we can we can come up with a topic and come up with something. But we are running hour and 10 minutes, 11 minutes. You've been kind enough to indulge us this far, so I appreciate that, Pete. And it's good to finally talk to you.
Yeah, no, it really is. Yeah, really nice. We've known each other virtually for 4 years, I think, haven't we?
Yeah.
And I really want to thank you actually publicly for proliferating my work. I'm very thankful for that. So thank you, and I know that your book is very good as well, and so on and so forth. So we are philosophical brethren, at least in the nihilist respect, are we not?
Yeah, well, I'll just say that, all this, like, much of the videos that I've produced on this channel and stuff have been inspired by things that you've done. You've really, I think, made philosophy come alive to a lot of people, and your work is so clear, your writings are so clear, and I think a lot of the field of philosophy is muddled with a lot of terminology that people don't understand. And I think that you bring a real sense of clarity to a lot of things, like Will to Power, your video on Will to Power, the philosophy of mind, when you were, dealing with, what was your book, your
Correlations,
your Mind Transcends Brain, any of those stone cold YouTube classics that you've produced over the years.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. I do think philosophy needs to be expressed in a more powerful way, really, and so I suppose that's one of the reasons for those videos. And the problem
Yeah,
now
my
is I
book
don't have
is
much
really-
time to make videos anymore. You know, I'm writing more essays and so on, and the PhD, of course, and teaching as well, teaching metaphysics and so on. But I hope to come back. You know, one video that people have asked me for years now is one on Bergson. You know,
Yes.
and that's, you know, I would base it on Bergson's Matter and Memory, mostly in Creative Evolution after that. But it's that's a big task, and I would devote a lot of time to create that, and I just haven't got the time at the moment. But one day I'll do it.
You need to bring back the epic music and the graphics. I know that takes you so much time.
Yeah, it does.
But you need to resurrect that shit, you know.
Yeah. Well, as I said to Warren Ellis, you know, ultimately I'm looking for a new form to express philosophy. So, I mean, my ultimate, Warren Ellis, the Marvel guy, asked me, what's on your bucket list? What would you like to do which is outside of your everyday sort of task? And I said, you know, I suppose, yeah, you know, like create a really interesting movie, as you'd say, based on some stuff from the philosophy of mind, for instance. And there are, you know, the philosophical movies. You know, David Bowie's son, he created, I think he's a philosophy graduate, and he created like Moon and some other films based on certain philosophies. But I mean, that's just scratching the surface of philosophy, isn't it? I think there's a possibility to create a film which would teach someone or go into as many details as an academic paper does, you know, but without being dull. I think that's possible, and I suppose that's a long-term goal I have.
So Ontologistics the movie then.
Perhaps, yeah, something like that.
Will you be playing yourself?
You know what? I haven't given it much thought at all. I mean, it just sort of, it's just at the beginning of its journey at the moment. But maybe in the future. But anyway, my main concern at the moment is to get a doctorate, and after that I can think about new projects.
What are you gonna do when you get your doctorates? Are you just gonna like start teaching again, or?
There are two routes basically that I see before me. One is to gain tenureship to become professor ultimately at university, and the other one is to become a sort of more of a public philosopher, something like this. So, and ideally both, or maybe I don't know. So basically, those are the two general options that I see in front of me at the moment, but that could change.
You could write more, pop out some more books, and
I will certainly write more books either way, yeah. But I just don't know the precise emphasis of the future yet. But you know, time will tell.